Okay, hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for waiting as people are trickling in. We're going to begin today's discussion. My name is Marina Tkachenko. Some of you might be already familiar with our webinars, but I'm the Marketing and Communications Manager at Myriad USA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our first webinar of this year on withstanding crisis, building donor relations for long-term success. Before we dive deep into discussion, please allow me to just take a brief moment to introduce or reintroduce Myriad USA, but also mention a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is part of Myriad USA's series on sharing best practices in fundraising, designed to help nonprofit professionals worldwide enhance their fundraising practices. Myriad USA facilitates thoughtful, effective giving across borders. We provide donors with a simple and efficient platform to support nonprofit initiatives overseas, and we also partner with foreign nonprofits and offer them cost-effective solutions to raise funds in the US through a service called American Friends Funds. And many of you here are in the room. I see familiar faces, might already work with us. But if you wish to learn more, please feel free to contact us at info@myriadusa.org, and they'll be in the chat as well, or visit our service page. You may also find the URL in the chat. Participants are in listen-only mode, and the chat function is closed. Nevertheless, we really do welcome and encourage you to share your questions and comments just in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screens. We'll have time to answer many of them live, so please don't hesitate to do that throughout the discussion. Translation is also available through closed captioning. Please click the Show Captions button in the Controls toolbar and select your preferred language. And lastly, materials and the recording will be made available after the sessions, so be sure to look out for follow-up communication. And now, I am beyond excited to introduce today's moderator, Lindsay Marino Long, and she will continue the discussion and also introduce the speakers. But Lindsay Marino Long is a fundraising strategist with nearly 15 years of experience designing donors' journeys that drive long-term value. As Vice President of Donor Engagement and Retention at Faircom, New York, she leads omni-channel strategies across sectors, including international relief, rights-based advocacy, health, and cultural philanthropy. She works across direct response, mid-level and major giving, and alternative giving to improve retention, accelerate upgrades, and deepen supporter connection. And I hear that this is a very exciting and close to heart topic to Lindsay. So please, Lindsay, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you everyone for joining today. You're very correct. This is a topic near and dear to me. And really, I'm going to say something that we all know. Our job as fundraisers is tremendously rewarding, but it's also very challenging. And the first half of this year, I think, has brought some additional uncertainty for a lot of organizations because really there's so much pressure to get money in the door. And we often feel this pull to prioritize some of our highest value donors, push through to that moment of asking, and then move on to the next target. And really, with that pressure, it grows as we throw up new barriers and difficulties, which I think is what a lot of organizations have been experiencing at the start of this year. So what we're here to talk about today is how we can shift that focus, because we really are living through a moment when transactional fundraising is not only unsustainable, but it's really going to be burning out our staff, eroding trust with donors, and it's going to cost more than it returns. So how can we start to flip that model? And I don't want to minimize the current context, but to ask everyone to just step back and think about how this mindset can push your organization into a cycle of urgency that really leaves little room for some of that long-term thinking that's going to make your operations more sustainable. And what's more is that donors are really looking for something beyond that transaction as well. They want more relevance, more authenticity, more connection, and that's really where today's conversation begins. So how do we move from quick fixes to relationship first strategies that help to deepen that trust, build resilience, not just for our fundraising teams, but for the communities we serve, of donors, of our program clients and beneficiaries. And we're going to break this conversation into 3 segments. So focusing on the context, then talking about some practical applications, and then really diving into forward-looking discussions about how to make that shift to relational fundraising, which is going to be more resilient for your organization. And so I'm really thrilled to be joined by 2 panelists who have complementary and deeply relevant perspectives to this discussion. First, Allison Fine is president of Every.org, a tech for good nonprofit that makes fundraising simpler and more accessible. She's a recognized leader in human-centered technology and the author of 4 influential books, as well as the recent Relational Fundraising Playbook, which, as you can imagine, is very relevant to today's discussion, which calls for that shift from transactional to relational models, really honoring donor dignity and sustainability. Allison's work at Every.org covers nonprofits nationwide, and she's really a champion for relational fundraising at scale. Also joining us is Ishmam Rahman, who leads the audience and donor strategy team at the International Rescue Committee, or the IRC. And they've really driven a shift to audience-led fundraising that leverages a relationship approach across a variety of high-value donor groups. So thinking monthly sustainers, mid-level donors, and so on. They bring over a decade of experience with crisis response organizations, including Lambda Legal and the ACLU, really shaping intentional, community-centric donor journeys that emphasize interdependence, shared humanity, and equity in giving. So I want to thank you both so much for being here and for sharing your expertise with our audience.
Thank you for having us, Lindsay.
Yeah, same here. Thanks for having us. Very excited to be here today.
Great. So first, I did want to zoom out to that big picture. So how did we get there, or here, not there? And how do we bridge the gap to better reach our donors when urgency can really overshadow sometimes the drive for connection? So Allison, I'm going to start with you because you've talked about this leaky bucket. You've underscored that a lot of organizations are maybe one lost grant away from imploding, and that sounds like a lot of stress. So I'd love it if you could talk a bit about what you've seen driving that dynamic and what you think nonprofit leaders might be missing.
Thanks, Lindsay, and a huge thank you to our friends at Myriad USA. We just love our partnership with you all. So this has been decades in the making, Lindsay, right? There's been a conventional wisdom for decades that raising money from everyday donors, people giving less than $500 at a time, say, requires constant asks, right? And it creates this hamster wheel of transactional fundraising. We send out, every communication has an ask in it, and we're just churning through donors at a furious pace. And the best indicator of how poorly this works for organizations of any size is that on average, only 20% of donors make a second gift to an organization. That creates what we call the leaky bucket. And now organizations are in a panic year over year to fill up the bucket again, where it's empty. You got to keep filling it up. And it adds so much stress to organizations to be so focused on really expensive donor acquisition efforts. And it's driven often by boards that center their work on cash in the door this month, this quarter, right? So you've got this exquisite pain point of losing donors very quickly, needing cash in the door, pressure from boards to move faster, and it drives the burnout rate for development folks. It makes staff miserable. It's just such a hard job to have. And now this year, Lindsay, add all of this dreadful economy and environment to it. So that's how we got here.
Yeah, I'm sure that that's resonating with a lot of folks in the audience. I'm sure it's also resonating with Ishmam. And Ishmam, turning to you, I think that a lot of that sentiment is what has driven the push at the IRC to have this audience-led focus, as we talk about. Of course, it doesn't mean that solicitation isn't there, but this approach is centering more about stronger relationships with donors. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the difference between kind of a more traditional channel focused approach and an audience led model, and how that fits into this equation.
Yeah, thanks, Allison, for sharing that, because I think the churn of donors really resonated with me. And when I first came on board to the IRC, and I think this is a issue that happens at a lot of emergency responsive organizations, is that acquisition is really big, right? Because a disaster happens, external world event happens, and you get a lot of donors coming in, and organizations like ours often depend on these moments. But then we also end up spending more to retain those donors in years where there are less disasters, say less big events going on. And so when I came on board to the IRC in 2022, there was a huge influx of the Ukraine donors. And I think leadership at that time really looked at these donors and asked, what can we do differently here and actually try to retain these donors, because this is the biggest cohort of donors we've ever gotten. And something that we noticed was that there was a lot of organic mid-level giving. And for mid-level donors, it's easier to do relational fundraising and making that case to your board or to leadership because the ROI is so much higher, right? And so there was this really good opportunity there to start doing relational fundraising, prove out that it works with mid-level donors for the next 2 to 3 years, and then scale it to other audiences. So that's exactly kind of what we did. We used to, our first year retention rate with mid-level donors used to be in the 20s, mid 20s. And this fiscal year, our first year retention rate with mid-level donors is at 45%. And, the fiscal year hasn't even ended yet, right? And so we worked really hard to not only improve overall retention rate, but to improve multi-year retention rate as well. And to start having the conversations of, LTV is also important, right? Lifetime value. What is the donor bringing? How many plan giving leads are we getting? So we started adding all these other little elements to the conversation and started shopping that around to leadership so that they also understood how valuable these donors are outside of just in-year net revenue. And so I think that also helped us break down the silo between acquisition and retention. They're connected. They're not separate programs. And in the same way, all channels are connected. They're not separate channels. To retain donors, you want to make sure that they're hearing from you from everywhere, and that they're hearing a cohesive story. And making those changes really also impacted retention rate positively.
I think it would be great to step back because you both talked about, when you're talking to the board and making this case to invest in relational fundraising. If somebody is thinking about fundraising as just making the ask, that moment of getting the money in the door, how do you explain the ethos of relational fundraising to them in a very basic and understandable way?
Would you like me to start?
Sure, dive in, Allison.
First of all, Ishmam, 45% mid-level retention. Hurrah for you. That's amazing. Lindsay, this is simple math. It's not even complicated math, right? It costs you 7 times more to acquire a new donor than to retain an old one, right? Every board member should understand that. But this is also a leadership imperative. The staff are not going to have the permission that they need to center donor retention and invest in it unless and until the C-suite and the board say, this is our top priority. And so it's both a math problem, it's a leadership problem, and then you add a human problem to it, which is donors do not like being treated like ATM machines. That should not be hard for people to understand, but it becomes hard when you're working within this vortex of the leaky bucket, right? The leaky bucket makes it very hard to get outside of yourself, outside of your organization, and just listen to donors, right? To spend time asking donors what it feels like to donate to your organization, why they're here, what their story is. And we'll talk about this in a few minutes, Lindsay, but that's where AI can come in and help and relieve some of that pressure. So I think it's super important to make sure to have this conversation at the board table, to center the donor experience for your organization. It is not just about how fast can we do this, and to make sure your organization is aligned in its values of wanting to treat donors like whole human beings who have a lot to offer.
Anything you would add to that, Ishmam?
Yeah, I mean, I think that really speaks to the culture shift that's necessary in organizations that want to move into relational fundraising and audience-led fundraising. Because, I think what I've struggled with is trying to explain that patience is really necessary to look at revenue per donor go up when you put in a strategy. It's not as simple as, an A/B test, or, it's really relational fundraising is really a combination of art and science. And making the case that we need to at least do this for a period of time to take a look at the holistic picture is really important for the results. And so you also need to change the way you're looking at your data, you're looking at your analytics. And I just want to add, I think when you tell donors you're not going to make an ask, that you're simply there to talk to them, they love that connection. And that in of itself drives organic giving. At the ACLU, we started a survey pilot where we asked them different questions about our communications every month via email. And one thing we promised them is that we will never, ever ask you for money. That group, after 2 years, had a 91% retention rate. The group that opted into these surveys, right? So it really speaks directly to what Allison was saying, in the sense that we created that buy-in with leadership, in saying that just be patient with us, give us this 2-year lead time and you'll see the results. But yeah, we started small. And so whatever you can do to create like some sort of test, longitudinal test, I think can be really helpful for leadership to see.
And I think that gets to, actually, it was a question that someone had submitted in the registration process, which was, what does a trust building moment look like with your donors? And I think that that's a perfect example of one of those ways that you can create trust with donors. And then when you deliver on it, then you're strengthening that trust over the long term. And that, trust is the foundation of every relationship, whether it's between a donor and the organization that they love, whether it's between you and people in your personal life. We know that trust is fundamental. But of course, in this context, what we're talking about is that there is some of that fraying trust. I think, Allison, as you had pointed out, when every communication is an ask, the donor starts to feel like, okay, I am just this ATM and you don't see me as a full human being in this relationship. And that leads to the donor fatigue. So we can understand that these are the concerns, but then, naming the problem is the start. And now it's about how we translate that understanding into action. So I think, Ishmam, you started to touch on some of those tactics that can be used, but I'm hoping we can transition now to think about how we can help donors feel more connected, even when we're thinking about it at scale. Some of these things will work in one-to-one relationships, but you can also do them with larger audiences. So maybe, Ishmam, if you can continue on a little bit to talk about some of the other tactics that have gone in at the IRC as you've made some of this shift, because I think people might get some inspiration of things they can do with their donors.
Yeah, so in our program, especially our mid-level program, our bridge program, and our mid-level program is for donors that give anywhere between 1,000 to 20,000 cumulatively, and our bridge program consists of donors that give anywhere between 500 to 999, and so for these donors, we really have found that relational fundraising really works. And I know that everyone says survey your donors, but that's really, really important because we have about, I would say, I think 80 or 90,000 of these donors. So obviously whatever we do has to be scalable, but it also has to feel personalized. And so paper surveys, online surveys have been super successful with them, but it's been successful because not only do we take their answers, we collate that data and then we report back to our donors. When donors feel like their answers are going into a black hole, they know that you're not really engaging with them. And so it's really important to report back to them. We'll share back, quotes from donors, what they're saying. Something that was one of my favorite pieces that we did last year was a report back on a paper survey that they did. And we created a report. Instead of doing an impact report about your organization, you're doing an impact report about your donors and the community and the impact that they're having together. We also asked donors, who are you giving to? A lot of our donors said that they gave to CARE, UNHCR, and MSF. Our donors don't see us as separate entities working separately. They see us working together. And that's the conversation we need to be having with them as well. And so in this report, we said that you care about the world and you give to so many impactful organizations because we do this work together. And so having a lot more community-centric language, I think also helps donors feel more hopeful that their dollars are having this vast impact because we're a network of organizations that are having this impact together on our clients. Yeah, I mean, the surveys are one tactic. And then we also just do a lot of cultivation calling, a lot of stewardship. We really focus on making sure that each quarter is broken up and very balanced between cultivation and solicitation. And it doesn't mean that cultivations don't have a way to give. There's always a way to give in every single piece if people want to, right? And so it's really about figuring out how to make those passive asks, but making donors feel like you're really communicating their impact and not over asking. So, they'll save that piece for later or they'll save that URL for later, whenever it is, right? Because I also think if you don't put that passive ask in there, it will hurt your revenue. So it's really about a balance. And I think it works really well, especially with special audiences like mid-level and bridge and sustainers.
Allison, I think that was probably a lot of music to your ears in terms of some of those tactics. But you also had run a boot camp. I think it was with 9 different organizations, and I'm guessing they were of all different sizes, different sectors. What are some of the maybe lower cost things that some of those organizations started to pilot in a relational fundraising model, and what really worked?
So the 9, Lindsay, were actually all very small organizations because we wanted to see what could you do in terms of relational fundraising when you don't have many staff people and time is the resource you have the least of. And so, you used the word mindset at the top, Lindsay. And so this is first a mindset shift. First, we want to change how we think about donors, right? Because nothing can happen otherwise. Second, we're willing to start an experiment. And Ishmam, you were talking about, creating intentional experiments and having an experimental mindset going into this. I think that's terribly important. Third, Lindsay, for all organizations, you're doing too much. You're trying to do too much. It is the nature of being in social change organizations. We want to try to fix everything. And if you're a new organization, you're doing too much because that's what you think you're supposed to do. And if you're a legacy organization, you're doing too much because nobody ever took anything off the table. right? You still do that program because somebody 10 years ago started that program. In this moment in time, financially, it is really important to get to the essence of what you're trying to do, to really focus on what activities get you closer to these outcomes, and to stop doing things that are not completely necessary. And then find one experiment in the next year that you can do that will improve the donor experience, right? So flip over the telescope. Organizations look at the world from what's important to us and trying to communicate that out. We need to flip it over and see what's important to donors. How do they feel? How are they welcomed? How connected do they feel? And find one experiment. It could be a local giving circle by zip code, for donors to come together and meet at a coffee shop once a month. They at least have your cause in common to begin with. It could be picking up the phone and calling 10 donors a month and just hearing their story, no asks involved at all. It could be having your board members pick up the phone and thank donors. There are lots of ways of opening up avenues for listening, for engagement, and for ultimately, because I think the ultimate aim here is not just donor retention, Lindsay, but the creation of a group of ambassadors for your cause that raise money as well. That would be an enormous lift, particularly for smaller organizations.
And it's interesting, there was I forget, and I feel bad that I can't call out this person to give them the credit, but they had done a little bit of a study on when we asked donors to share their gift, for example, on their social media after making a contribution. And rather than just saying, I gave to this organization, the post that performed better were when you had someone taking that ambassador role saying, this organization is doing such great work and you should see ABC. And I'm so proud to be partnering with them.
Yeah.
Having that personal touch and building those types of relationships is really transformative.
The campaigns that do amazingly well on every.org are those created by donors. They can be match campaigns or fundraising campaigns. You can set them up in a second on every.org. And all of a sudden you have a person asking other people, not an org asking people. And it just changes all of the dynamics. Oh, we've muted.
I did not hit that button correctly. Retention is obviously really important. I think thinking about if we're moving someone towards a second gift is really important, but what are some of the other types of ways that you measure success with these approaches when you're making the case for example, the longitudinal tests so that your board feels like this is the right investment to make? What are some of the metrics that you report back to them?
Definitely revenue per donor, and then, looking at your lifetime value, looking at donors, say, if you want to do a direct mail longitudinal test or you want to do a multi-channel longitudinal test, I would take a look at the lifetime value of organic multi-channel donors that have been given and talk about how much more that would go up if we converted more donors into multi-channel donors. And so yeah, just I think looking at giving them the 12-month projection, 24-month projection, 36-month projection to really make that case, and to also be realistic about those projections. And then I think also, honestly, especially with board members and leadership, I feel like anecdotes really work. The quantitative is nice, but I think sometimes if you are talking about relational fundraising, real quotes from real donors in terms of what they want from you, what they want to hear from you, what really worked for them, why they came to the organization, those things have been able to move the needle for me as well sometimes, which is, as a marketer, kind of odd because you just want to take a look at just the data. But for leadership, that's really great for buy-in.
And Allison, I think that you had highlighted in your playbook that some of those qualitative measures can be just as effective as some of the quantitative.
I think that's so spot on, Ishmam, because ultimately giving is an emotional act, right? People give because of a story they heard or an experience they had, and to feel better, right? Giving makes us feel better. A group called Give Directly, which provides cash to people in need, ran a fundraiser in January for the LA wildfires and disrupted their regular cadence, right? They usually followed up the next month with another ask to donors. And instead of that, they came back with a story of this is how many people you helped in your zip code. And the zip code was really important to people. They got a huge number of emails back from donors of, holy cow, this feels good, right? Now we've got something to build on. So we really have to focus. Ishmam said at the top, this is both art and science, right? We've really got to focus on this balance of wanting to cultivate donors and getting to that ask with the fact that this is a deeply human experience and we want donors to feel great about their gifts because then they'll come back.
And just because you talked about the wildfires, it just made me think of a story. Well, not necessarily a story, but we just decided to do this because we heard another organization was doing this, and we were like, that makes a lot of sense. At first, we suppressed all the LA donors, right? All the zip codes that were affected from the wildfires. Of course, don't send them any direct mail, email, or anything like that. But then after 2 to 3 weeks, we had conversations with our relationship managers, and we decided, these are not just our donors that were asking for money. These are real human beings that are being affected by this. Why don't we just do a wellness check? No ask, nothing, just ask and reach out. I hope you're doing okay. We're thinking of you. It's been a hard time, that kind of thing. And we got so much engagement from that because it had nothing to do with our organization. It had nothing to do with our mission because we don't respond to wildfires nationally. But yeah, exactly that. I mean, people are human first, and we need to be talking to them like that.
And they will remember that outreach for a really long time, Ishmam.
And I think, so there's several questions that kind of coalesce around this area, but part of it is, we think about maybe more complex impact reports and things like that, which I do think are important to share with donors because we do want them to feel like, that gift is having a transformative impact in the work. But, what are some of the other types of communications that can keep them connected, caring about, and aware of what we're doing? Or some of the channels that you've found be particularly effective for this? In terms of just keeping those relationships warm and vibrant. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead, Ishmam.
I think something that we've been testing and looking at is SMS and peer-to-peer text. And I think for small organizations, these two channels make a lot of sense as well because they're cost effective. And the great thing about SMS and peer-to-peer text is that even if somebody doesn't respond, they will look at it. So oftentimes we actually do use SMS as a cultivation tool, and then we pepper in solicitation. It's a very good, time sensitive channel, right? If you are responding to emergencies. And I also think that there is this misconception that your higher value donors are going to get irritated or frustrated by SMS. Or if your demographic is an older population on average, then they won't be engaged with SMS. But the truth is everybody has a phone, everybody's looking at their SMS, everybody has grandkids, they're texting their grandkids, or they're on Facebook or whatever it is. And so I think taking the leap is really important. And, if you get a bad response that's overwhelming, then you can just, stop. But that's why I think you can start with cultivation first. But yeah, I always encourage, organizations of any size to really test that channel and be more bold with it because other organizations are doing it. And it's not going to be new if you do it. I don't think that anyone's going to get particularly more irritated than they already are from the text they're receiving from other organizations. So yeah, that's kind of the channel that we're really focusing on. And also just want to add that it's also the channel that we're seeing the most success in sustainer conversion, right? People don't really look at emails anymore. you don't have like good open rate metrics and everything. And so I do think that SMS is like the new frontier for giving.
Allison, any other kind of communications tactics that you would spotlight?
I think that, so what SMS does is also opens up the opportunity to be in conversation with younger donors, right? So at every.org, our donors skew younger, 45 years and younger, in part because of the user interface, in part because we accept all payment methods. And payment methods is something to really think about because younger people are expecting to give by mobile payments, right? Young people, they don't have credit cards. They want to give mobile. They might, they might have crypto to give. So we want to open up all channels for communications, all channels for payments to allow people to come in whatever door works for them.
And I think we've talked a lot about leadership already. And so I did have some questions when it came to thinking about how we future-proof these strategies, being, getting that leadership buy-in. But another piece that is, of course, essential when we think about how to make these sustainable in the future, these types of relationships, is really starting to think about AI and how that can be leveraged in a way to save time. Allison, you were so right. The thing that none of us can make more of is time. And I think you've really been looking into some of the tips and tools that can work really effectively with AI across a bunch of different organizations in terms of who you're speaking with at every.org. So could you speak a little bit more about that?
Sure. So AI is on everybody's mind, and it is this big, scary, enormous thing that most people in organizations don't know what to do about right now. Here are some facts, Lindsay. The fact is it's here and it's going to grow very quickly, and it's coming into organizations whether we ask for it or not. And it might be that it's coming into your organization built into other software that you're using. Maybe you're using an HR software to screen resumes, that's AI. Or maybe you're using it to reconcile budgets, that's AI. So it's here, it's in the mix. The most important question, Lindsay, is how can we get intentional about its use to have the greatest benefit to us? I wrote a book in 2022 called The Smart Nonprofit, Staying Human-Centric in the Automated Age, right? So how can people stay in charge of AI to give us the greatest ROI perhaps ever in our last 150 years? And that actually is time, Lindsay. AI is great at sucking up rote tasks for us, at doing things like drafting communications, saving huge amounts of time, or, reconciling the budget or screening resumes. All of that is intended to free up time. Then the question, Lindsay, is what are you going to do with another, say, 20% of your time? Are you going to supersize the hamster wheel of transactional giving, which you could do, or are you going to safeguard that time all for relationship building, which is what I hope happens within organizations, but that's a leadership challenge. It's not a technology challenge with AI. AI is super easy to use. We're using it every day, right? You can use ChatGPT right now. The question is, how can we use it to benefit our staff and our donors? And if we're not being really intentional about repurposing that time to connect people to one another, to tell stories, to problem solve, to build community, then we've lost the greatest ROI that we could have had with it. Any organization of any size, and I know that there are folks working in very small organizations here with us today, can use AI right now. You could build a chat bot. You could use ChatGPT. Step very carefully and think very hard about, is this adding more to our current transactional model, or is it freeing us up to be in conversation with people and to help us share our story with people?
And Ishmam, are you looking at AI applications within your program currently, kind of taking some of the time back to also be more intentional with your donors?
Yeah, definitely. And I love what Allison said around, what is the ROI of the, time that you're saving? And something that I really encourage my team to do is, yes, we should be doing business as usual, but also we should all have at least 1, 2 new innovative things we want to do in each fiscal year, right? And I have them, and this is like a culture that's been built by the head of mass markets, the team I'm on as well, is that every single person comes with some sort of innovative new strategy that they want to try, and they pilot it in some small way, and whatever is successful we scale it, right? And so in this kind of culture, we do end up looking at a lot of AI tools. So something that we're considering right now is an AI tool that basically helps us communicate with donors faster, right? Where the AI basically builds in your own voice and tone an email for that donor and personalizes it based on the information it finds from Salesforce, and then sends that email and asks for that meeting. The meeting still has to be done by a human being, right? That's still relational fundraising. But the amount of donors you can reach out to in an hour, it has been multiplied by 3 just because of this tool. I know a few other organizations are using it. And so right now what we're really looking at is looking at it and trying to figure out how that's going to impact long-term revenue, and really making that case for leadership to then finally bring that tool on. In terms of modeling and for AI for data, we are already kind of doing that, working with different vendors, layering different models together to find the best of the best donors, best of the best prospects, and even for analytics, right? When our analytics team don't have a lot of capacity. If you have a good AI tool, you can kind of plug in the numbers, and you should definitely double, triple check your work. But it can give you kind of a skeleton of the argument you need to go do a new thing, right? When maybe the analytics team might not have capacity to do that. So we've been trying to get more creative, right? Using it in content development, analytics, and even simple things like, taking notes during a meeting so that it frees up our time to do more with actual donors instead of, figuring out what the action items are, things like that.
And this kind of, I'm going to pivot this onto an application of AI piece, because I do think that it's out of the box. It's not going back in. But there was one person in the Q&A who asked, what's one practical tactic that a small team could take this month to try and build stronger relationships? And I don't necessarily want to say it has to be related to AI, but I'd be interested, if they don't have a huge budget, what might be some of those tactics, maybe both an AI centric one that leverages this tool, and then maybe something that doesn't rely as much on AI. But Allison, maybe you can hop in first.
Sure. If I was running a small organization right now, Lindsay, the 2 things I would do is, 1, call 10 donors right now and ask them what's most on their mind, how they're feeling, and how they feel as a donor to your organization. And then 2, I would look at using AI, which is probably built into any package they're using. If they're using, say, Microsoft, they have Copilot. Google, you've got Gemini, and streamline your information flows, because that is sucking up most of your time. Where is the information? My inbox is overloaded. All of those ways that we are spending hours a day looking for info, sharing info, reminding people of things. That's where I would start. It's free. It's part of any, any package, any software package that you have. Pick somebody on your team to be an expert in that.
And then and Ishmael, I'm going to pick your brain on this afterwards, but I do know, just to follow up on this, and I think that you did call out Beth Cantor's work on AI and ethics in your playbook as well. But for organizations that maybe have some of those hesitations, Allison, would you recommend that they check out her work, or other sources that maybe they would want to refer to make sure that they're doing it in an ethical way?
Oh, sure. So Beth is a longtime partner of mine, and she's got lots of resources on using AI responsibly, ethically, and well. NTEN, NTEN also has a lot of resources for smaller organizations on the use of AI.
Yeah, I think those are some great tips, and I think that's also at the front of everyone's mind when it comes
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
talking about AI. But Ishmam, pivoting to you and kind of put on your hat from when you weren't at the IRC as well, because you've also been at some smaller organizations, you've worked with smaller teams. If you were looking at this moment right now, looking ahead in the next month, what is that practical tip that you would think about leveraging?
I completely agree with Allison that I would definitely pick up the phone with 10 donors. But, outside of that, I used to be on a two-person development team. And we would do that. We would just pick up the phone and ask donors, why they're giving, what they're interested in. And the other thing that we would do is we would do a lot of handwritten notes. And if you can't do it for all, do it for some, anywhere you start, it works. And honestly, that was so successful on a small development team. Now I do it even in large teams with a huge number of donors. And obviously it's different. We'll do real pen or automate it with a vendor, but it really makes a difference with donors because they feel like a real person is looking at their gift, having a conversation with them. You could even just write, PS like, thank you so much. This is my name, like gift officer, whatever it is. Call me if you ever want to talk. I always make sure that there is personal contact information or what looks like personal contact information on every single thank you
Yes.
donor receives, no
Yeah.
matter what. Nothing should be a generic name, and it should not be the general phone number of your organization. And another, thinking about boards when you do have a smaller organization and a very involved board. Another thing that we also did is whenever we sent out a cultivation or appeal, we would print it out and send it to a board member and ask them to write a small note on each one, and they would send it back to us, and then we would send it to donors. So it was a whole process, but those appeals did the best. Because yeah, like, Allison was saying before, you want a donor ambassador to really be involved and show that they believe in your mission too. And that's literally why they're writing a handwritten note.
Mhm. I love that. But there's an organization I know, Lindsay, who has a thankathon an hour before every board meeting. It's a great way to engage board members who may be nervous about fundraising.
Board members are always nervous. I'm on a board too, and the other board members are nervous about fundraising. And I try to break that down. I think thank yous is one of the best ways. Everybody likes to be thanked, and it's not overwhelming and frightening. And again, it's still so essential to the fundraising process. So I love doing a thankathon, and I'm going to take that to my next development committee meeting. So I do want to transition over to some of the other questions that have been flagged here. Um, One person was asking, because they're in an organization that isn't necessarily in an emergency context or dealing with things that might be considered urgent. I think we can always think about ways to frame our programs as, urgently needing funding, but how can relational fundraising support such organizations in their fundraising with private donors? And in fact, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective, Allison and Ishmam both, I think that relational fundraising actually makes that program much stronger than if were relying on that urgency of an earthquake, for example. But what are your thoughts?
My thought is this is where storytelling comes in. You have to answer the why for your donors, and that is going to come largely in story form. So if you are working in advocacy or you are working on longer term services areas, that is where having stories that stay with you and the donor for a longer period of time really come in. And Lindsay, organizations have tended to be afraid of a lot of questions. Like Ishmael was talking about making it easy to find a human within the organization, right? We want to create opportunities for conversation, not just one-directional communications. So I think that organizations ought to take the opportunity to share a story, invite donors into a place, virtual or on land, and have a conversation about it and be very frank. This is why the work is so hard. There is no harder work than social change work. If it was easy, we'd all go home. This is super hard work. And, I think we need to be frank with donors that this is what makes it hard. And not, I see so many emails that are basically an organization's to-do list going out to donors, right? We need you to give us $100 so we can do this and we can do this and we can do that. And there's this separation of like a professional staff and volunteers and donors out there, and they need to come together. It starts with story, and then it starts with an invitation to engage in conversation.
Yeah, just building off of that, because yeah, completely agree. I think storytelling is really the way to engage donors and especially make donors see that this is the long game, right? Social change takes time. What does that look like for somebody you're serving? And so something that we try to do at the IRC, and we've tried to do this, I've done this at more institutional, less crisis responsive organizations as well, is showing the arc of whoever you're serving, like their journey, right? And actually just like you could even frame it as the journey of your donation, and that's the story, right? And even have the client or the person you're serving, the constituent, tell that story. I think kind of you framing it that way makes the story more powerful, makes the story more ethical also because it gives agency to the people that you're serving, and retains the donor for the long term instead of thinking I'm just going to give it in this one point and then I'm done. You actually, and I think that's also a great way to kind of frame it for sustainers as well, right? Like the sustainability of, or the solution to this problem is only possible if you're with us for the long haul.
And then I think, Allison, I know that you have spotlighted that even lapsed donor reactivation rates are pretty pitiful right now, and that relational fundraising can really be key to making those engagements stronger. And I think it's related to a question from Richard in the chat, but thinking about rebuilding relationships with donors who supported your work as an organization, but then they stopped after a particular project closed out. How to think about re-engaging someone who maybe has shown interest in the past and using some of these principles in a way that can open that door back up.
Yeah. So the first thing, Lindsay, is stop just sending them solicitations. They're not working. We all know they're not working. And your unsubscribe rate is much, much higher than your engagement rate. So I think you want to look for opportunities to bring those folks into conversations about the work that is not about fundraising, right? They had an interest. That interest hasn't changed. Their attention might have changed. Now, see if we can bring them into a conversation at a local coffee shop led by a board member, say, about what the organization has been learning this year, or what impact the organization had this year, and open up other lines of conversation and communication, not just communication, but conversation with those folks, right? They are as generous as they've always been. You've lost their attention. So I would look for, and I would test all sorts of different mechanisms. Maybe it's an online conversation, maybe it's local, to just re-engage them as humans, and just try to find something that interests them. Now, look, you're not going to, create an entire program for one donor. You're going to test this out with many lapsed donors. But I would really steer away from thinking, how can we ask them for a donation better, faster, quicker, more? And how can we learn more about them as humans and connect better with them?
We're actually launching like a small reactivation pilot, because most of our relational fundraising, especially with relationship managers, are with donors that have given in the last 24 months. But just, in the same vein of what Allison's talking about, and focusing on reactivation donors and asking them, what they're thinking about, what do they want to engage in. We are going to engage around 2,500 lapsed donors that have last given, higher gifts 24 months ago. And there's going to be no ask. I think we're either going to do like a 3-month or 6-month test, and we're going to see if those conversations lead them to reactivate at year end, right? And so that's why we're kind of running it. We're going to start it in a month or so, and we're going to run it through the end of fall. And the other tactic that we want to try out, which I got from another peer of mine, is texting them and saying, "Hey, I just want to reach out to you and talk to you about our work, and I'm going to give you a call in the next 15 minutes. I hope you're available." And that I've heard increases the number of pickups and engagement, or the donor engages back and says, "No, actually, can you call me back at this time?" And so I think pairing those kinds of tactics for donors who haven't engaged with you can be really effective. And, like Allison said, like testing what really works. And also bringing in what these reactivation donors, what is the gift they came in on in the beginning? Was it a particular campaign? Maybe keeping it smaller is better, so that you can personalize their reactivation engagement conversation more.
I'm going to mash up 2 questions here because one person said that they love the idea of calling up donors to ask how they're feeling, how they're doing, but then wondering how, as fundraising professionals, how do we respond to this when there are so many unknowns right now, especially if the organization also maybe is going through this period of change. And it's related to another question that someone posed, which is, how do you stay authentic and relationship centric when ultimately you're building these relationships to keep the fundraising and the resourcing of your mission going? So how do you balance some of those real world things that are operating around this and still make these relationships feel true and authentic to the donor?
So let me say something. The pressure that development staff are under right now is extraordinary, and my heart goes out to folks doing this work right now. It's so hard. But let's also be really clear, Lindsay, that the kinds of acquisition and retention methods people are often using now are super expensive and don't work. And if you're just going to keep going back to that playbook of we've got to ask, you're going to keep getting a 3% response and a 19% retention rate, right? So do the math on that. Try to keep the demons at bay if you can. And then, as Ishmam said earlier, we have to get to the art of this. There is no hard right answer about how often to ask people, right? But unless we're going to engage in relational ways with them, they're going to be one and done. So if you want your organization to be more sustainable in the future, you need more everyday donors, more mid-level donors to be the base of support. And don't stop doing everything you have been doing today, right now. Start an experiment, see where and how you can get that donor retention rate up, and build from there. But whatever you're doing, Lindsay, please don't go back to the old playbook. It doesn't work.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. Ishmam, I know that I just saw you unmute yourself, so I want to give you a moment to say a few final words, and then Allison, also, if you have any final words before I hand it back over to Marina.
I've also found success in just being honest with your donors. I think your donors are feeling what you're feeling, just, the state of the world, just so much changing so quickly. I think being as authentic as possible, but also if you share why you do this work, oftentimes that also resonates with the donor, because sometimes that's the reason why they're giving. And so talking about finding that shared resilience and shared hope with your donor, I find is very effective in conversations with them. So that was the only thing that I was going to really add. I think it's okay to be honest. Why you do the work and why you're fundraising, because you care about the mission.
And any final words, Allison?
Thank you for doing this, Lindsay. Thank you to our friends at Myriad USA. This is a really timely moment to have this conversation, and I just want to say amen to Ishmam saying, be authentic. All you can be is yourself, and people are looking for ways to help right now. And your organizations out there have ways for them to be generous and to feel great about it.
Well, I have to say thank you to both of you for sharing your insights, to everyone for joining us. I know that I'm walking away with a lot of new ideas of things that I'm interested to try to build some of those authentic donor relationships. And I'm going to hand it back over to Marina again with my thanks to everyone, and take care and keep building those connections.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lindsay. Thank you, Ishmam and Allison, and everyone for joining us today. Be sure to look out for the recording and additional resources that will be available in the coming days. And also, if you have a moment, please take our short survey, where you'll also be able to give input on our future topics, something that we haven't thought about doing, and also feedback on today's discussion. We would really appreciate that. Subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on LinkedIn, and also feel free to connect with Ishmam and Allison for any follow-up if you'd like to continue the discussion. Thank you very much, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you at our future events.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.